They say true love is a force that transcends everything, but what happens when that love is born exactly where it shouldn't be? Where the world sets barriers and even the law itself seems to conspire against those who dare to feel. This is the place where hearts meet, where every stolen glance, every forbidden touch, carries the weight of rules, silence, and judgment. Here, living this love is like walking on the edge of a cliff, knowing that the slightest misstep could plunge them into chaos. Amid whispers of censure and judging eyes, they continue. Every encounter is a risk, every feeling a transgression. The world around them seems to exist only to remind them they are wrong, that what they feel shouldn't exist. Yet the heart does not bend. It defies, insists, resists. And in that defiance they find beauty, intensity, and the certainty that some emotions are so pure, so deep, that no rule can contain them. They live in the shadows of society, where words are dangerous and simple gestures become acts of courage. Between silences that scream and eyes that watch, every moment together is a silent manifesto of love, a protest against conventions that cannot comprehend the truth of their feelings. With each touch, each secret shared, they feel the heat of something that defies logic, morality, and expectation. A love born in the cracks of the forbidden, blooming even when everything around threatens to crush it. And yet they persist, because some loves do not bow to norms, loves that do not ask permission to exist. They exist in the spaces between life's lines, in the pauses between decisions, in moments no one sees. A love that defies laws, that moves through shadows and watchful eyes, a love that proves the heart when true never surrenders. Get ready to dive into this intense story, where every heartbeat is a challenge, every touch a revolution, and where love, even forbidden, refuses to die. Here they do not just love, they resist, defy, and live, living that love everyone says is impossible. The first rule was silence. The second was distance. And yet, there she was, standing on the opposite side of the courtroom hallway, heart pounding so loud it felt illegal, watching the one man she was never supposed to love sign documents that could destroy both of them. Outside, reporters waited, cameras hungry for scandal. Inside, time held its breath. Their eyes met for less than a second, just enough to remind her of nights filled with whispered confessions, stolen glances, and a love that grew in the shadows, fed by risk and restraint. Loving him had never been safe, but losing him would be fatal. In a country where laws were clear and unforgiving, their hearts had crossed a line long before anyone noticed. And now, with everything at stake, she realized the truth too heavy to ignore. Some loves don't break rules by accident. They are born to challenge them. No one in that building knew what had started years earlier in the most ordinary place possible. No one knew that behind his calm posture and professional reputation lived a past buried on purpose, a truth that could ruin careers, families, and lives. She had sworn never to speak his name out loud, never to reach for him in public, never to admit what her heart had already decided. But as the judge's door opened and footsteps echoed closer, fear crept in with a single terrifying thought. Someone had found out. A file was missing. A secret was no longer safe. And if the wrong person connected the dots, love would no longer be the greatest risk. It would be the evidence. As her phone vibrated in her pocket with a message she wasn't supposed to receive, she understood that the past was done hiding. And whatever was about to be revealed would change everything forever. She had built her life on discipline, on rules that made sense on paper and kept emotions neatly contained. In Washington, D.C., where power strode through the streets in tailored suits and words were weapons, she had learned early that vulnerability was a luxury few could afford. Eleanor Whitmore was respected, admired, and feared in equal measure. A senior legal advisor to a federal institution, she was the woman people turned to when consequences were severe and mistakes unforgivable. From the outside, her life seemed untouchable. A penthouse apartment, a flawless resume, a future already etched in bold letters. But at night, when the city hushed and the lights blurred through the windows, loneliness settled beside her like an uninvited guest. He lived on the other side of that world. Daniel Carter moved through the city unnoticed, the kind of man people walked past without a second thought. He worked maintenance at a federal building downtown, blending into hallways and service elevators, carrying tools instead of influence. His days were repetitive, his presence invisible. No one asked about his past, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Silence had become his refuge. What the city didn't know, what Eleanor could never know, was that Daniel hadn't always been no one. A single choice years ago had stripped him of everything that once defined him, leaving behind a man who learned to survive by staying small. Their lives collided in the most unremarkable way. A broken elevator. A late night. A quiet conversation that should have ended there. Eleanor noticed him because he listened without interrupting, without trying to impress. Daniel noticed her because behind the authority and sharp intelligence lived a woman exhausted from carrying the weight of expectations alone. They began exchanging words the way people exchange confessions. Slowly, cautiously, pretending it meant nothing. Coffee cups left on counters. Brief smiles in empty corridors. Moments so simple they felt harmless. But simplicity can be dangerous. In a country governed by strict lines between power and anonymity, between what is allowed and what is forbidden, something began to grow where it shouldn't have. Eleanor felt it first, a warmth she hadn't known in years, a sense of being seen without judgment. Daniel fought it longer, knowing too well what loving the wrong person could cost. Yet each encounter pulled them closer, threading their loneliness together until separation felt impossible. And without realizing it, in the heart of a system built on law and order, two souls began rewriting rules neither of them had the right to break. The first signs of trouble arrived quietly, disguised as routine. A lingering look held a second too long in a hallway monitored by cameras. A whisper cut short when footsteps approached. In a building where every movement was recorded and every relationship scrutinized, discretion was not optional, it was survival. Eleanor understood that better than anyone. Her position demanded distance, control, an image beyond reproach. Yet the more she tried to restore the boundaries she had spent her life enforcing, the more fragile they became. Loving Daniel was not only forbidden, it was dangerous in ways she could no longer ignore. Rumors began the way they always did, without names, without proof, carried on lowered voices and suspicious glances. A colleague asked casually why she seemed to spend so much time on the lower floors. Another joked about the friendly maintenance guy, who always seemed to be nearby. Each comment felt like a small cut, invisible but cumulative. Eleanor responded with composure, her voice steady, her expression unreadable. Inside, fear tightened its grip. She had built her career on the idea that she was untouchable. Now for the first time she felt exposed. Daniel sensed the shift before she spoke of it. He had lived long enough in the shadows to recognize when the air changed. Supervisors watched him more closely. Security protocols suddenly mattered in ways they hadn't before. Once invisible, he became noticeable, and not in a good way. A mistake as minor as leaving a door unlocked was enough to earn him a public reprimand. In front of people who had never learned his name, he was reduced to a warning, a reminder of how easily someone like him could be replaced. The humiliation burned, not because it was unfair but because it was deliberate. The unspoken truth between them grew heavier with each passing day. Eleanor tried to protect him by pulling away, by turning brief conversations into cold professionalism. The distance hurt them both. Daniel, already accustomed to being overlooked, felt himself shrinking further, questioning whether he had ever truly belonged in her world. He watched her move through rooms filled with power and certainty, and a painful thought took root. Loving her had been a mistake from the beginning. When the investigation was announced, it felt inevitable. An internal review. Anonymous concerns. A reminder that personal conduct was inseparable from professional integrity. Eleanor was summoned to meetings where questions were carefully worded but razor sharp. Daniel was reassigned, stripped of familiar routes and routines. They stopped seeing each other altogether. Silence, once their refuge, became a punishment. Alone, Eleanor faced the reality she had avoided, that the system she had defended her entire life would show no mercy. Alone, Daniel confronted the old fear he thought he had buried, that no matter how hard he tried to disappear, he would always be the easiest one to blame. And somewhere between judgment and fear, their love was being quietly dismantled, piece by piece, by a world that had already decided who deserved to stand and who was meant to fall. The separation did not erase what had been built, it sharpened it. Absence became a mirror, forcing both of them to confront truths they had been avoiding. Eleanor discovered that the silence in her apartment was louder than any courtroom. Without Daniel's quiet presence, the city felt colder, the victories emptier. She began to notice how often her strength had been mistaken for wholeness, how rarely anyone had asked who she was when the titles were stripped away. In trying to protect her reputation, she had almost lost the one place where she didn't have to perform. Daniel, reassigned to a satellite facility miles away, found that distance did not lessen the ache but clarified it. For years, he had survived by minimizing himself, believing that invisibility was safety. Loving Eleanor had awakened something reckless and alive inside him, something that refused to return to sleep. He started writing again at night, something he hadn't done since before everything fell apart. Pages filled with thoughts he never planned to send, words shaped by a hope he no longer tried to deny. For the first time in a long while, he didn't want to disappear. He wanted to be seen even if it hurt. They found each other again through the smallest cracks. A book left intentionally on a bench between buildings. A note slipped inside with no signature, only a line that meant everything to both of them. A coffee shop neither of them had ever visited before, chosen because it belonged to no routine, no surveillance, no expectation. When they finally sat across from each other, there was no apology, no explanation. Just recognition. The kind that doesn't need words. What grew between them in those stolen moments was no longer reckless. It was deliberate. Eleanor learned to listen instead of control, to let uncertainty exist without rushing to dominate it. She began questioning the rigid truths she had defended for so long, recognizing how easily law could ignore humanity. Daniel learned to stand straighter, to speak with quiet confidence, to believe that his past did not erase his worth. He stopped shrinking in her presence and started meeting her gaze without fear. Their love changed shape. It became less about escape and more about choice. Simple gestures carried weight, shared silence, hands brushing without urgency, conversations about dreams they had never allowed themselves to imagine. They didn't promise each other safety. They promised honesty. And in that honesty both were transformed. Eleanor was no longer just a woman defined by power, she was someone capable of surrender. Daniel was no longer just a man hiding from who he had been, he was becoming someone new. Together they created a space where judgment could not reach, where class and status dissolved, where two imperfect people learned that love did not demand permission to exist. It demanded courage. And quietly, steadily, they began to change not just each other, but the paths they once believed were fixed beyond question. The reckoning arrived without warning, wrapped in formality and fluorescent light. Eleanor was called into a closed session with senior officials, the kind that left no room for interpretation. On the table lay a file thicker than it should have been, its edges worn as if handled too many times. When it was opened, her breath caught. Inside were records that should have been sealed years ago, details from a case she remembered all too well. Not because it had defined her career, but because it had haunted it. Daniel's name was printed there, unmistakable, alongside a past identity no one was supposed to uncover. He had not always been Daniel Carter. Years earlier, he had been a federal prosecutor whose career ended the moment he refused to bury evidence in a high-profile corruption case. The choice had cost him everything. Disbarred, discredited, quietly erased, he had accepted obscurity as the price of integrity. What the file now revealed was worse. Someone had reopened the case not to correct the injustice, but to use it as leverage. And Eleanor's involvement with him had become the key to making it work. She understood instantly what was being demanded. Distance would no longer be enough. To save her position, she would have to testify against him, frame their relationship as manipulation, paint him as a man who had used proximity and deception to gain access. The law would be satisfied. The truth would be destroyed. Daniel learned of it differently. Summoned by security, confronted with documents he recognized as his own history, he realized that the life he had rebuilt in silence was being stripped away again. When he saw Eleanor's name attached to the inquiry, something inside him fractured. Not because he doubted her feelings, but because he understood the trap. Loving him had placed her directly in the line of fire. They met one last time before the hearing in an empty courthouse corridor after hours. No cameras. No witnesses. Just the weight of what was coming. Eleanor confessed everything, her voice breaking for the first time. Daniel listened, calm in a way that terrified her. He told her the truth he had never shared, not about the case but about why he had stayed small for so long. He believed that some truths were too dangerous to live out loud. As footsteps echoed closer, Eleanor made her decision. When the hearing began, she stood and spoke, not as a legal strategist, not as a protector of institutions, but as a woman refusing to betray love. She exposed the buried corruption, named the coercion, and claimed her relationship openly. The room fell silent. Careers ended in that moment. So did lies. Daniel watched from the back, realizing that the greatest risk had never been loving her. It had been believing the truth didn't deserve a voice. The aftermath was not gentle, but it was honest. Eleanor resigned before she was asked to, walking out of the building without looking back, her name already echoing through headlines stripped of nuance and mercy. The world that once applauded her precision now questioned her judgment. Yet for the first time in her life, she did not feel like she was losing herself. She felt like she was finally choosing who she was. Daniel faced scrutiny as well, but this time the truth stood beside him. The reopened case unraveled quickly once exposed to daylight. What had once destroyed his career was now recognized for what it had always been, a punishment for integrity. Restoration did not come overnight, and some losses could never be undone, but dignity returned in ways silence had never allowed. He no longer needed to hide to survive. They did not step into a perfect future. There were no guarantees, no effortless redemption. They moved to a quieter city where no one knew their story, where mornings were defined by simple routines and evenings by conversations that no longer had to whisper. Love, they learned, was not proven by sacrifice alone, but by the courage to live truthfully after the storm passed. What had begun as a forbidden bond forged in secrecy became something stronger, a partnership rooted in choice. Eleanor learned that law without empathy becomes cruelty, and that authority means little if it demands the denial of one's humanity. Daniel learned that humility does not require erasure, and that worth is not restored by permission, but by self-respect. Their story did not change the world, but it changed the way they moved through it. And sometimes that is enough. Because love is not measured by how well it follows rules, but by how deeply it honors truth. When hearts defy silence, when they stand against fear and consequence, they remind us that second chances are not granted by systems. They are claimed by those brave enough to choose them. In the end, what remained was simple and unbreakable. Love that began in the shadows survived judgment, and proved that even in a world governed by laws, the most powerful justice is the one we give ourselves. The aftermath was not gentle, but it was honest. Eleanor resigned before anyone could strip the decision from her, walking out of the building as her name echoed through headlines that reduced a lifetime of integrity to a single forbidden choice. The world that once praised her precision now questioned her morality. Yet for the first time she felt whole. She had lost status, influence, protection, but she had kept herself. Daniel faced judgment too, but this time the truth did not abandon him. The case that once erased his identity was reopened under daylight, and what had been buried by power slowly collapsed under facts. Justice did not arrive with applause or compensation, but with dignity restored. He no longer needed silence to survive. He no longer needed to disappear. They did not chase a fairy tale ending. They chose something quieter and braver. A small town. Anonymous mornings. Honest work. Conversations spoken out loud without fear of walls listening. Love, they learned, is not defined by how much one sacrifices, but by the courage to live truthfully after everything is taken away. Eleanor understood that law without empathy becomes cruelty. Daniel understood that humility should never mean erasing one's worth. Together, they discovered that second chances are not granted by institutions or permission. They are claimed by those who refuse to betray their own humanity. Their story did not rewrite the system, but it rewrote their lives. And sometimes, that is the most powerful revolution of all. Because love that begins in the shadows and survives judgment proves one undeniable truth. When hearts defy silence and fear, they remind the world that truth is stronger than rules. If this story moved you, if you believe in love that defies labels, power, and fear, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, like this video, and share it with someone who believes that real love is always worth the risk.